Welcome to the last lesson of Section 1 of Module 3, working with fMRI data. Today we're going to be talking about applications of fMRI to conclude our section on the biological basis of fMRI. So by now, we've talked about brain activity, visualizing brain activity, as well as interpreting fMRI. And so what we know is that different regions of the brain are responsible for different functions, and fMRI is particularly good at measuring this because it has good spatial resolution. And it also measures brain activity indirectly through the BOLD response, or the blood oxygenation level dependent response or signal. So what we're going to answer today are these key questions. So how does fMRI help us understand the brain? How is fMRI used in brain surgery? And how is fMRI used in neurological disorders? So first of all, for understanding the brain, two types of fMRI are often used. There's resting state fMRI and task-based fMRI. So resting state fMRI allows scientists to understand the basic functional networks across the brain. So some studies have looked at resting state fMRI in infants, for example, and this has shed light on the functional network development. There's also task-based fMRI, which is used to identify brain region activity when a patient performs a task that requires a specific neuronal response, for example, motor movement or language processing or some sort of visual stimulus. Now we want to answer how fMRI is used in brain surgery. So fMRI can be used to develop a surgical plan before operations. So the way this is done is a patient executes simple tasks in an fMRI scanner, and this visualizes the tumor with relationship to functional areas of the brain when overlaid with anatomy. So this allows the surgical team to make a more informed decision before conducting the surgery and making sure they're not hitting any important functional pathways during the surgery. And this is really important and relevant because, according to some studies, fMRI was actually thought to be responsible for a low rate of permanent neurologic deficits following surgery. There are some limitations to this, of course. For example, tasks must be performed accurately and have to be selected appropriately for them to be able to visualize the functional networks of a specific brain region that the surgery is being performed on. And trained staff also have to be present to instruct the patient and direct those tasks. And another thing is that analysis techniques actually have not been standardized. Certain functional networks are difficult to identify. For example, the sensory motor system, which is low level, is relatively well studied and easy to identify, but the language system, which is high level, is much harder to identify, but actually very important for preoperative mapping. And lastly, task-based versus resting state fMRI overlap, but not completely. So fMRI can also be used for neurological disorders. It can study diseases like Alzheimer's, dyslexia, anxiety, epilepsy, stroke, and more. So for example, here, this is a scan of a Parkinson's disease patient, and it's kind of showing the changes in these specific regions of interest in a Parkinson's disease patient. And then here are some visualizations of other disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar, compared to a control. So you can see, like, for example, these regions seem much smaller in terms of activation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some specific diseases. First off is epilepsy, which is a disorder. It can be a genetic disorder or caused by brain injury that's characterized by seizures, and it's caused when neuronal activity in the brain is disturbed. So a seizure is basically overactivation of the brain, and it usually has an origin point in one of the hemispheres, and then it spreads to the other hemispheres. So fMRI can be used for preoperative mapping before epilepsy surgery, because there's epileptic or epileptologic lesions that can be removed. So this is a non-invasive alternative to the WADA test. And the WADA test is an invasive procedure performed that identifies the side of the brain that controls language, and it shows areas of stronger memory function in the brain. And it's usually used before performing epilepsy surgery, which is designed to remove the seizure center, either the seizure center of the brain or limit seizure activity in a specific region. But fMRI actually provides a more specific brain mapping before epilepsy surgery, and is also non-invasive, which is significantly more or less uncomfortable, I suppose, for the patient. It can also be combined with EEG to estimate the relationship between the hemodynamic changes in the brain from the blood flow and epileptic activity. And actually, simultaneous recording of fMRI and EEG allows for even better localization of epileptogenic lesions. And now on to fMRI and Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disorder characterized by memory loss, confusion, and loss of other mental functions. You can see up here, here's an fMRI comparing a control patient to a mild Alzheimer's disease patient. So fMRI has been used in Alzheimer's to better understand impairment of activity in specific areas of the brain, especially during memory tasks in Alzheimer's patients. It's also been used to attempt to map memory encoding process networks in the brain to better understand how memories are lost in Alzheimer's disease and other mental functions as well. Another thing is that fMRI can be used to monitor and predict the course of cognitive design in patients throughout the course of the disease. And lastly, hopefully, analysis of fMRI patterns can eventually lead to a clinical biomarker for Alzheimer's and improve diagnosis for this disease. So this was a pretty short video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this section. Just as a summary, fMRI has a lot of clinical applications, anything from preoperative mapping of brain functions to neurological disorder treatment and diagnosis, all the way to the higher level of understanding the brain as a whole. And what's next is going to be an intro to fMRI data, so fewer of these videos and more Jupyter notebooks for you guys to go through and to kind of start playing with some example fMRI images and also an fMRI data set. So I hope you guys enjoyed this section, and let us know if you have any questions.